I live in a town where everyone sleeps before 10 p.m. It has become some kind of custom now. People lock their doors, turn off their lights, and crawl into bed as though their lives depend on it. Even the stray dogs vanish into silence, and the world outside becomes still. As a kid, I'd ask my parents, "Why does everyone sleep so early?" They'd always give me the same answer. That's just the way it's always has been. But that answer never satisfied me. Why was it the way it's always been? What was so important about sleeping by 10 p.m.? My curiosity grew as I did. There was something wrong about the stillness of our nights. No one ever woke up, not even for a glass of water or to use the bathroom. Once they went to sleep, they were dead to the world until morning. I'd overheard whispers once, conversations among the adults. "He broke the rule," someone had said. "Never woke up again." They saw me listening and stopped talking, but the seed of curiosity had already been planted. What really happened after 10 p.m.? One night, I decided to find out. That evening, I followed the routine like always. Dinner at 7, TV until 9, and then to bed. But this time, I pretended to sleep. I lay there with my eyes closed, listening as the town settled into its nightly stillness. At exactly 10 p.m., everything became silent. A silence so heavy it felt alive. I waited for what felt like hours, though it was probably just 30 minutes. Then, slowly, I opened my eyes. My heart pounded as I sat up, every creak of the bed frame sounding deafening in the oppressive quiet. I tiptoed to my bedroom door and cracked it open. The hallway was empty. I could hear the sound of my own breathing. Slowly, I crept to my parents' room to check on them. They were fast asleep. Their faces were calm and undisturbed. For a while, I just stood there, watching them. But as I turned back toward my room, that's when I felt it. A presence. Not something I could see or hear, but something I knew was there. The air grew colder, pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. The hair on my arms stood on end, and my instincts screamed for me to run. And then, I heard it. "Why are you awake?" I froze. My mouth went dry, and my limbs felt like lead. But then I thought, it's Mom. It has to be Mom. I felt relief for a moment, but as I turned toward the voice, I noticed my parents' room. The door was still ajar, and I could see them lying in bed, motionless, breathing softly, asleep. If they were asleep, then who? The voice cut through my thoughts, louder this time, with anger. "Why are you not sleeping? You were supposed to be asleep." The sound was coming closer. My chest tightened as I turned the corner, and then I saw it. It wasn't my mother. Not my father. Not anything human. The figure was impossibly tall and thin. Its skin stretched taut over its skeletal frame. Its face, or the space where a face should have been, was a void. A swirling black emptiness. "It's all your fault. You should have stayed asleep." Panic overtook me, and I ran. My legs felt like lead. My breath came in sharp gasps, but I didn't stop until I slammed the door of my room shut behind me. The knocking started immediately. Loud, violent, relentless. Each blow shook the door, and I pressed myself against it, tears streaming down my face. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. Silence. For what felt like hours, I stood there, trembling, waiting for the next sound. When nothing came, I thought it was over. I thought I was safe. I opened the door, and that's when I realized something was wrong. The world outside wasn't the same. The air was thick, suffocating, and the walls of the house seemed warped, their colors dull and faded. The clock on the wall caught my eye, and my stomach dropped. The hands weren't moving. It was 10 p.m., and it always would be. I don't know how long I've been here. Days, weeks, years. Time doesn't exist anymore. Not in this place. The town is empty now. No parents, no neighbors, no life. Just me. Wandering the streets, searching for an escape that doesn't exist. I haven't eaten or drunk anything since that night, yet I'm not dead. I should be dead, but I'm not. My body has changed. I've grown taller, impossibly thin. My skin stretches tightly over my bones, and my reflection in broken glass reveals the truth. My face is gone, replaced by a void, a black nothingness. I don't feel human anymore. The memories of my life before are fading. I've grown angry, angrier with each passing moment. At myself, at the town, at everything. And then, one day, I saw something. A boy. He was small, frightened. I watched as he tiptoed down the hallway, peeking into his parents' room. The sight filled me with rage. "Why are you awake?" The boy froze, his eyes locking onto mine. And in that moment, I realized the truth. I wasn't watching him. I was watching myself. And now, I understood. I had stayed awake, and now, I was the one who ensured no one else ever would. When I met Blake, my life changed. I'd never had a real friend until I met him. Even in kindergarten, I'd be that weird kid who'd spend recess on his own in the corner. It was in the summer of 1993. Blake's family moved in a few streets down from us. His mother, Lilybet, determined to worm her way into the country club, knocked on the door of the largest house in the suburb, and presented my mom with a fresh peach cobbler. They too were inseparable from that day forth. Every time Lilybet would come around for a wine evening with my mother, she'd bring Blake along. I never knew what his father worked as, but I did know that he was only ever around on the weekends. I hit it off with Blake instantly. We'd spend long summer evenings upsetting wasp nests and drinking Hawaiian punch, while our mothers kept a loose eye on us from the porch. My backyard doesn't really end. Instead, it leads into the green blanket of Jefferson National Forest. Blake and I would spend hours playing in the maze of trees, building forts and sword fighting with sticks. We'd dare each other further and further into the woods, but eventually, one of us would always chicken out before we went too deep. Usually me. Blake was my best friend for 5 years. We'd still hang out every day, even after our parents had a major falling out. I suppose we both knew that we had no one else to fill our time with. He went missing on a sticky summer day in 1998. His mother had begrudgingly dropped him off at my house. My mother asked Blake about his day before we went out exploring, as we put it, into the forest. Once we were far enough from my house, Blake took out the flip knife he'd stolen from his father. We played around with it for a while, taking turns doing the slowest finger fillet imaginable and using it to sharpen twigs into arrows. It was while we were playing that stupid knife game that I managed to stab myself through my middle finger. I cursed and grimaced and tried not to cry in front of Blake. I slumped onto a rotting, moss-covered log and nursed my mutilated finger. For some reason, I thought blowing on it would help. Blake made an unhelpful joke before picking the knife up and sitting next to me. I told him I was fine, and he started to list off some facts he knew about tetanus. I shoved him off the log, and we both laughed. Blake got up, brushing the leaves off himself, and told me he'd just gotten a great idea. He said that while we had the knife, we should carve our names into a tree. That way, anyone who sees the message will know that Blake and Robbie are best friends. I told him it was a great idea, and that he should pick out the sturdiest tree he can find, while I go get a plaster. Blake began his expedition, and I walked back to the house, holding my still bleeding figure in an old tissue. I didn't realize how close we were to my house until it quickly came into view, and I hoped my mother hadn't heard me swearing. She was lying back on a deck chair, reading a gossip magazine and sipping from a glass of white wine. She jumped up as soon as she noticed my hand. Soon after, my finger was lathered in germaline and wrapped in a Band-Aid. I lied and told my mother that I'd cut it on a particularly sharp stone. She seemed to buy it, or at least I thought she did. She told me to be more careful and sent me on my way, shaking her head and muttering something about me being reckless. I wandered back into the woods to look for Blake. I stumbled across the old fallen tree I'd been using as a bench, which lay just out of view of my house. I looked around but didn't see Blake. I called his name and got no reply. I started to meander around, weary that Blake could jump out at me at any second. He was always like that, playing tricks on me. Once he left his grandmother's old doll that he knew I hated in my room after a sleepover. He still wishes that he'd been there to see my reaction. I'm wandering between the trees, further from my garden, and deeper into the unrelinquishing forest. Something catches my eye, a metallic glint. I turn to see an old oak tree, its limbs tangled and broken like a car crash victim. It was the oldest tree on the property, as far we knew. It lay right on the invisible boundary where our land ended and the administration of the United States Forest Service began. I begged my father to let me build a treehouse on its branches when I was younger, but the answer was forever no. I took a step closer. I saw what had caught my eye. Blake's flip knife was sticking out of the bark, around shoulder height. I looked at it, puzzled, and grabbed the handle. With some effort, I managed to pull it out. Blake must have lodged it in deep. I felt the weight of it in my hand, trying to balance it on my index finger. Blake had cleaned my blood off the blade. I guess he picked the old oak as the tree we should carve our message into. I pocketed the knife and looked around. Still no sign of Blake. I still wasn't convinced that he wasn't just hiding behind a bush somewhere, ready to pounce on me as I walked past. I called his name again. No reply. Only the sound of wind echoing between the wooden mesh and tangled branches. Worry began to set in. I heard my mother call us in. Pizza was ready, apparently. All I'd had to eat that day was a stick of apple-flavored chewing gum that I had accidentally swallowed. So pizza was an alluring mistress. I looked around and spoke in no particular direction. "Come on, Blake. Mom made pizza. Homemade this time as well. None of that frozen crap." I was sure that he'd hear me and come running out, eventually. I made my way out of the forest and back towards my house. "Where's Blake?" my mother asked as I sat down on the picnic table. "He's around somewhere," I replied. "I reckon he was trying to prank me. He'll come crawling out of his hiding spot as soon as he smells this." We laughed and began to eat. By the time we'd finished, Blake's portion was still lying cold on his paper plate, now congealed in grease. Mom began to worry. She was like Blake's second mother, and practically was his mother when his parents were going through their divorce. As soon as I finished, she sent me back out to the forest to look for him. This time, she came with me. Half an hour later, there was still no sign. My mother made me walk her through our entire afternoon. I confessed to her that we'd been playing with a knife. I immediately felt like I shouldn't have. She berated me about safety, but stopped suddenly as she began to think the worst of what could have happened to Blake. She didn't tell me, not wanting to upset me, but I could tell what she was thinking. What if Blake had cut himself? Worse, what if he'd been running, knife in hand, and tripped on a root? My mother called Lilibet soon after. She arrived before the hour's end and started a screaming match with Mom as soon as she burst through our front door. Something about losing her sweet baby boy. I wasn't sure. I had my hands over my ears for most of it. The police came next. They assured us that since he'd only been gone for a little more than an hour, there shouldn't be anything to worry about. He was probably sitting by a tree, nursing a twisted ankle. Lilibet filled in a missing people's report just after sundown. The rest of the day was a hectic search. Eventually, my mother told me to go back inside and go to bed. I protested, wanting to be the one to find him, but eventually relented. She led me back to the house and tucked me into bed before she rejoined Lilibet. I managed to fall asleep, weariness winning the battle against worry. I was woken up by talking just outside of my bedroom window. I checked the time. 6:02. I rolled out of bed and went to my window and peered outside. There was a group of people congregated in the garden, a search party. A few carried torches, although it was already bright enough to see clearly. I recognized some of the men from around town. Mr. Hall, my geography teacher, was the first one to catch my eye. He gave me a sympathetic wave and went back to listening to the police officer, who was organizing the group into smaller parties. Soon thereafter, they set off into the woods. By the time that I got up, Blake had been gone for 15 hours. It's a myth that you have to wait 24 hours to report someone missing. Really, you should do it as soon as their absence becomes suspicious. Some law enforcers do suggest waiting 24 hours, but that's just an advisory, or a polite way of saying, "Ma'am, could it be that your husband is just blackout drunk in a ditch somewhere?" That day, the search party found nothing. Not a piece of cloth or lost shoe. There was no trace of Blake at all. The police brought in sniffer dogs, which were equally ineffective. The searches began to peter out after 3 weeks. Local law enforcement explained there was simply nothing more they could do. Still, people didn't give up hope. Lilibet would spend hours on her own, wandering through the woods looking for her son. She'd often turn up at our house late at night, looking for a place to stay, so she could resume the search as soon as her tired body allowed her. It was a wonder that she never got lost herself. Police suspicion immediately fell on my father, even though he was working at the time of the disappearance. He had a criminal record from his teenage years, nothing major, but they used it as rope to tie his noose. As the sheriff kept repeating that they had no new information, the townsfolk became increasingly agitated. They tried desperately to use my father as a scapegoat, a patsy, but there was nothing. No evidence that Blake had even left my backyard, let alone for a murder. My father avoided jail, but not the death of his reputation. My father lost his job, although he was never convicted. The stigma of being the lead suspect in a missing child case was not good for a children's ombudsman. He couldn't find work anywhere in town. Months had passed now since Blake's disappearance. I was back to being friendless and heavily bullied at school. I'd still walk home with Blake every day, though, as his missing posters lined every lamppost from the school to my house. My mother began working again, being able to return to her position at the local women's college. It was enough to keep our family afloat, but not my parents' marriage. Their divorce was finalized on Millennium Eve. I knew it was coming, although I enjoyed ignoring the signs. My father spent most of 1999 drunk at home. High school was a nightmare, but at least it gave me a sense of normalcy. I like to think that I was a good student. Not that it mattered. I had to drop out of college in 2008 to care for my mother. She passed away from lung cancer in 2009, leaving me alone with the family home and more debt than I'd be worth in a decade. I lost contact with my father after my mother's funeral. Last I knew, he was living in a trailer park near the coast. I should have sold the house. Anyone in my family I still talked to told me that. The place was far too big for one person. Too hollow. I should have sold it, but I didn't. Buried in the walls of that house were the memories of my happy childhood, and that was priceless. I did have to sell almost every item of furniture, every piece of jewelry, every last possession, just to keep my head above water. Worst of all, I had to work in retail. My life was at a dead end. Every day was the same as its predecessor, and will undoubtedly be the same as its successor. I'd wake up, go to work, come home, eat, drink, sleep, and wake up again the next morning. The only thing that kept me going was Lucy. She was a cashier at the small corner shop I worked at. She was a little younger than me. Her parents had kicked her out when she was 19. The art college she attended kicked her out as well a few short years later. She ended up back here and has been stuck in a cycle of part-time jobs ever since. We were good friends, as much as I wanted us to be more. We'd go out for drinks as often as we could, sometimes catch a movie at the local art house cinema. She's dated a few guys in the time I've known her, but nothing that didn't last more than a few weeks. I was comfortable with our friendship. I didn't want to end up like just another month-long romance. So, I kept acting like I was content with her calling me the brother she never had. If you're reading all of this and thinking that it sounds unhealthy and just a tad pathetic, then you're undoubtedly right. I just don't want to rock the boat. The night it happened began with me slumped across the front room sofa, gorging myself on off-brand cheese puffs and watching trash TV. I wiped the orange power from my fingers with my vest, picked up my phone, and messaged Lucy. "Do you want to come over for movie night?" It took her a while to reply. "Look out your window. It's the storm of the century outside." She had a point, I admit. It was the first big storm to hit us in 2016. It wasn't that bad now, but it was set to wreak havoc in a few hours. Lucy and I lived within a 10-minute walk of each other's houses. She'd usually pop over whenever she got frustrated with her housemate, which was often. Good movie weather. I chuckled at my own message. Lucy didn't reply for a few minutes, long enough for my show about housewives to end another about fishermen on steroids to begin. LOL. I took that as a no and set my phone back down on the coffee table. I rolled over and went back to watching the TV screen, regardless of whatever was being shown. I just switched my mind off. I didn't realize that I had fallen asleep until I was woken up. I groaned and slowly sat upright, the stale flavor of artificial cheese and Malibu on my breath. I sat there listening to the rain until I decided to get up and investigate the noise that dragged me awake. I stumbled through the living room and into the kitchen. I fumbled with the wall until my hand found the light switch, although I could tell what the problem was already. The light came on, and I saw that I'd left a window wide open. The curtains had caught the wind and knocked over a plant pot. The tiled floor was covered in dirt and bits of dead philodendron. I sighed and poured myself a glass of water, trying not to get mud on my slippers as I sat down in what used to be my father's chair at the dinner table. I swished the water around in my mouth and turned the kitchen light off so I could see outside. I sat back down and stared at the swaying trees at the foot of my backyard. At times like this, all I can think about is Blake. I wondered if he was still out there, somewhere. If I remembered correctly, the last theory from the county police was that he fell down a small cave entrance, one they, or anyone else, never could find. I spat the rinse back into my cup, then shrugged my shoulders and drank it. Suddenly, the room was filled with a spectacular light. I squinted as I saw lightning strike just beyond the tree line. It was over in a split second. Thunder followed immediately after. I laughed to myself, feeling sorry for all the dog owners in the neighborhood. I never had one, but Blake did, for a while. Charles, I think his name was. Blake would tell me about how Charles would howl and whimper his way through every storm. I stopped laughing when I saw the glow. It was faint at first, when slowly grew brighter. I got to my feet, leaned over the sink, pressing my forehead against the glass pane. There was definitely dull orange glow coming from the woods. Fire was the first thing that came to my mind. Back in June, a fire was started in a camper van lot, not all that far away. It burnt down a few people's livelihoods. The news reporters said that had been started by lightning. I began opening random drawers until I found a torch. I made sure it was working, grabbed a coat, and headed outside. I almost slipped on the wooden steps of the deck. I trudged across the garden, which had been turned to mud by the storm, and continued on towards the glow. Some cover from the rain was granted as I crossed the tree line. The beam of my torch fell over a mat of rotten leaves and twigs, a fallen log, and finally, an old oak tree. The bolt of lightning had split the thing almost in half. Part of the tree was strewn, still smoldering, on the ground. The smell of charred timber overpowered the petrichor. The split edges of the oak were a ring of embers, the source of the orange glow that led me here. I took a step closer and was stopped by sudden realization. This was the tree Blake was intent on carving our names into. The tree I found his flick knife sticking out of. The tree I knelt at every year on the anniversary of his disappearance to pray to St. Anthony. Tears clouded my vision as I realized I'd lost my last connection to him. I was confident that the rain would dampen any attempt the fire made at spreading. I sniffed and turned around to walk back to my dry home. Robbie. I froze. Someone had called my name. It was almost hidden by the wind, but I was sure of it. Robbie. It was a voice I recognized. I turned around in circles, bewildered, scanning my surroundings for the source. Robbie, please. I stared at the splintered oak tree. I found it. On unsteady feet, I stepped closer and closer still to the scorched stump. I turned my torch onto its brightest setting and leaned over the side of the stump, flashing the beam down its center. The heartwood was hollowed out. In the middle of the tree, encased in oak up to his shoulders, was a small child. It was Blake. "Robbie, please free me." I stared in shock and pure disbelief. I could tell my hand was shaking from how much the light danced around. It was Blake, but he's changed. His skin had the same color and texture as dried leaves. His eyes were milk white with a yellow tinge. His hair was a dirty mess, and his scalp was crumbling. He was still wearing the same red shirt he had on the day of his disappearance, but it had now faded to the point of grayness. Despite all this, I knew it was really him. I finally, after all these years, had him back, and he hadn't aged a day. "Blake," I whimpered, "it's really you." I reached out to try and hug him, but he hissed at me. I'm sure he was scared and confused like me. "Blake, please, I'm trying to get you out. Just hold on to my hands and I'll pull you out." Blake let out a long, rasping no before saying, "Only blood can free me." I took a cautious step back. "Blood? Blake, what are you talking about?" "Bring me blood. Bath me in it, Robbie. Free me." We stared into each other's eyes for a long moment. Then Blake's face contorted into a sickening grin. I turned and ran, straight back to the house. I fell into a glut of mud, but stumbled back to my feet. I clambered up my deck and fell through the glass sliding doors. I pulled the curtain shut with such force, I broke a few of the rings. I tore off my sodden clothes as I ran upstairs. I collapsed onto the bed in my childhood bedroom and fumbled around with the bedside cabinet looking for my Zolpidem. I took 4 and turned over for a restful night. For a blissful few seconds when I woke up, I couldn't recall the events of the night prior. And then it hit me. I laid in bed until I couldn't justify it anymore. I got up and made my way downstairs. The first thing I did was grab a broom and clean, as best I could, the dirt and broken pottery on the kitchen floor. Once it was acceptably clean, I made myself a coffee and sat down on the chair that had been turned to face the window. I took a scolding sip and internally debated what I should do as I watched the trees sway in the afternoon wind. By the time the mug was empty, I had decided to talk to Blake again. I made my way out of the house and onto the now familiar trail from my garden, out through the woods to the oak tree. Until I saw its split facade, I thought there was still a chance it had been all a dream. Any hopes of that ended when I saw Blake squirming around in the stump. He stopped moving when he saw me and smiled. "Who've come back, Robbie?" I want to help you, Blake," I said, in a voice barely more than a whisper. "You can help me, Robbie. Bring me blood." I stared at Blake in disbelief. I didn't know what to do, what to say. Every time I looked at him, I felt this weird sense of joy. I've wanted a chance to see him one last time every day for the past 18 years. Now, here it was, and I was thinking about turning my back on him. I couldn't understand what was going on, but I knew what I had to do. Why do you need blood?" I managed to stutter out. "It will bring me back," replied Blake. "Isn't that what you want?" I looked into his blank eyes and saw compassion. It was something I hadn't felt in years. "Okay," I said. "I'll do it." I'll help you. Blake whispered a "Thank you, Robbie," as I turned and walked away. I went back into the house to grab my wallet, my jacket, and the keys. I locked up and got in my car. I single-mindedly drove to the nearest butcher's. I parked on a double yellow line and made my way into some generic, corporate butcher shop. The walls were lined with cured meats and pictures of oddly happy-looking cartoon pigs. I leaned over the counter and was greeted by a barrel-shaped, middle-aged man who didn't look all that different from the animals he sold. "Do you sell blood?" I asked in earnest. "Blood?" replied the butcher. "Well, sure we do. Don't get much call for it, though. How much can I do you for?" I realized I wasn't exactly familiar with blood measurements, so I told him, "I'll take a gallon." The butcher sniffed and disappeared into the back. He returned a moment later with a large plastic container covered in frost. "I'm afraid we only have pork blood in stock, if that's all right." "Oh, sure, that's fine, I think," I told him. "Perfect. That'll be $18. I grimaced at the thought of giving up almost 3 hours' wages for a fool's errand. But on the other hand, my social anxiety prevented me from asking him to get a smaller portion. I reluctantly paid in full and waved the portly man a goodbye. The blood had begun to thaw on the back seat of my car, leaving a stain I knew I'd never get out. I pulled into my driveway and got out. I opened the back door and unbuckled the seatbelt around the container of blood. I don't know why I put a seatbelt around it. It just felt right. I lugged the cumbersome thing out of my car and carried it through my home, out to the garden, and into the forest. I heard a dull whispering coming from Blake. He stopped suddenly once Her saw me. "Hello, Robbie," he said, as I positioned myself in front of him. "I got what you wanted," I told him as I unscrewed the lid of the plastic jug. "Thank you, Robbie," he replied. "You're my best friend." I beamed a smile as I heaved the gallon of blood onto my shoulder. It began pouring out in a torrent, covering Blake completely in a clotless crimson. Enough of it splashed on my clothes to make it look like I'd been butchering a deer. Once it was empty, I set it down next to the stump and waited for Blake to be free. The blood began seeping into his flesh and the wood that surrounded him. There was a sound like a drain emptying as the liquid receded. Within a minute, he was completely clean. I noticed, however, that his skin seemed noticeably looser. I stood back, expecting him to squirm out of his oak prison. Instead, his face fell, and Her spoke in a slightly lower-pitched voice. "I need fresh blood, Robbie. Bring me fresh blood, and I'll be free." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Fresh blood?" I stuttered. "What do you mean?" He repeated, "I need fresh blood, Robbie. Bring me fresh blood, and I'll be free." I turned and stormed off. I thought I could help. I thought I was doing the right thing, but clearly, I couldn't help Blake, even now. I returned to my house and collapsed onto the sofa in a depressive heap. I felt such a strong, almost unnatural compulsion to help, but nothing I did felt like it made up for losing him. I knew it was dumb to blame myself, but at the back of my mind, I always felt responsible. It's been tied around my conscience since I was 12 years old, and now that I could finally put things right, I was second-guessing myself. Just then, the neighbor's cat jumped up on my windowsill. He curled up in a sunspot next to my box plants. I stared at his furry shape and realized what I must do. Slowly, I stood up from the couch and made my way into the kitchen. I grabbed the largest knife I could find from the drawer and stepped outside. The cat belonged to my next-door neighbor. It was a graying tabby. George, I think its name was. The neighboring family got it when I was just a kid. I couldn't imagine how old he must be. I grabbed him by the tail. At his age, there wasn't much more he could ask for. I brought this new offering to Blake. He seemed happier with it. With the knife, I managed to drain all the blood I could from that ginger ball of hair. Blake opened his mouth and stuck his gray, cracked tongue out as the blood dripped onto his face. He was like a small child experiencing snow for the first time. I felt a warmth deep inside me as he fed. "Is that better?" I asked. Blake replied, "I can taste life for the first time in years. Please, I need more." It was the answer I expected, an answer that I was resigned to. I had my best friend back, and I wasn't going to give him up. The next week was a blur of violence. Usually I had lunch with Lucy, but now I'd spend my breaks driving around town searching for lost pets and strays. I'd taken to using a sharpened screwdriver. It was the most humane way. My findings would stay in the trunk of my until I could go home and feed their blood to Blake. He told me he was growing healthier and was almost free, but it didn't seem like it. His complexion was even more sickly than when I first found him. His skin was now a dark turquoise, had a texture like leather, and looked like it was slowly falling off the flesh underneath. Seams had appeared all over the visible parts of his body, and they looked fit to burst. His left arm was free now. All he used it for was to play rock, paper, scissors with me. This particular day, I got off work and drove home with a Pomeranian wrapped in a bin liner in my back seat. I began my usual routine soon after getting back to the house. I threw the bag over my shoulder and trudged over to Blake's part of the forest. He watched me intensely as I pulled the small dog out of the plastic bag. I took out my cutting knife, but before I could do anything, Blake spoke. "Why are you poisoning me?" I looked at him, shocked. I tried to hide the frustration in my voice when I replied, What do you mean, Blake? I'm bringing you everything you asked for." Blake's childlike grin turned into a grimacing frown. Now, his facial expressions took ages to turn, as if he had to tell each individual muscle in his face how and where to move. "The blood of animals is sour to me now," he said. "And yet you keep showering me in it? Do you want me to suffer, Robbie?" I quickly jumped to my own defense. No, of course not. "What do you need instead?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Human blood. Those two words directed the course of my life from then on. I spent the rest of the day tackling this moral quandary. First, I attempted to contact a blood bank to inquire about a withdrawal, but I quickly realized how tremendously stupid of an idea that was. The next thing I did was research how much blood could a person lose without dying. From Google, I found that a person could lose close to 40% of the entire volume and live. I decided then that I would try and remove this from myself. It felt fitting, after all, that it'd be my own blood that frees Blake. The next few days were spent preparing. I checked in on Blake regularly to see how he was doing without my blood supply. Not only was he fine, he looked more healthy and normal than he'd ever been. He insisted, however, that going this long without blood would kill him, so I endeavored to hurry up. I made a homemade IV out of sewing needles, a turkey baster, and tubing from a long, dormant fish tank. I sat down on a chair in the kitchen, the IV next to me over a plastic bucket. I spent an hour sterilizing everything as best I could with what I had. I stabbed the needle into my cephalic vein and let gravity do the rest. Slowly but surely, the bucket began to fill up. I sat there until I felt dizzy. I groggily pulled the makeshift hypodermic needle out of my arm and collapsed back into the chair. After a few minutes, I managed to collect myself. I steadily got to my feet and looked at the bucket. There was barely any blood in it. I found a 1L measuring jug that I'd never used before and poured it in. It just about filled it to the brim. More than I thought, but nowhere near enough. I brought the jug out to Blake, careful not to spill any. His blank eyes lit up when he saw me. I held the jug over him, his mouth hanging expectantly open. I poured my blood, and he began to giggle, just like he would when we were kids. His gullet filled with my black clots, and it began to overspill, dribbling down his chin and down onto his chest. Once the glass is empty, I let it fall to the floor. Blake began thanking me, calling me his best friend, saying we'd never part. I felt a warmth I hadn't experienced since before my mother died. Wood splintered as he pulled his other arm free. I knew what to do. I leaned in and we hugged each other. We will never part again, Robbie. I know, Blake. I'll never let you go again. He smelt like death, but I didn't care. He pulled me tighter and whispered in my ear, but I'm still not free. I recoiled from his embrace. I should have known that he wouldn't be satiated. I had to avert my gaze from Blake. I could tell he was scowling at me. I walked back to the house, leaving Blake to calm down. I slumped onto my couch, trying to think of what I should do next. I noticed my phone on the coffee table. The past few days have been a mono-focused blur. I couldn't remember the last time I picked up my phone. I grabbed it and immediately saw that Lucy had been trying to contact me. I had dozens of unread texts and missed calls from her. I'd been doing my best to avoid her at work. She tried to come round yesterday, and I just hid in my room and pretended to be out. I tapped on the notifications and read through the catalog of messages. All had the same theme, something to do with my well-being. I lay back and decided to give her a call. The phone rang for a while before she picked up. She didn't sound as concerned as I thought she'd be, but she was happy to know I was all right. She repeated what she'd been saying over text, that I felt different, distant. I told her that I was fine, really, and that she should come over tonight. She agreed and said that she would be around at about 7 p.m. We wished each other goodbye until then, and I hung up. I had a plan. I knew that there was no other choice. If I wanted to free Blake, finally free him, then this is what I must do. I put on a jacket and slid a kitchen knife into the inside pocket. I sat and waited for Lucy. She arrived half an hour late, an impressive feat considering she only lived 10 minutes away. I could tell that she knew that something was up. I didn't know what to do, so I blurted out that I had been diagnosed with depression. It seemed to click for her, then what was wrong, and she took to comforting me as best she could. Lucy had always been a tree hugger. She made me try out veganism once or twice, but it never stuck. Hearing about my struggle, the first thing she suggested was that I should get out in nature more. She asked me if there was any place that I felt truly happy. I stifled a smile and told her that I knew a place. My heart beat like a tribal drum as I led Lucy from my house, through my garden, and out into the forest. I stopped for a second, letting her walk just in front of me as we came up to the stump. A few steps later, she saw it. Blake has metamorphosed since this morning. His skin had been replaced with a black mold. The only features of his face, his white eyes and teeth, floating in an inky nothingness. He didn't look like Blake at all anymore. His red t-shirt was gone, digested into his body. Wispy tendrils protruded from all over his body and connected him to the ruined oak that rose on either side of him. He still sat comfortably within the stump, but looked like he was beginning to spill out. Lucy let out a scream that sent the crows flying from their perch. Before she could run, before she could react, before she could do anything else, I grabbed her. I pushed her forward until she was inches from Blake's grinning maw. I took the knife from my pocket and slit her throat. Her screams turned to a gurgle and then ended. Blood poured from the wound and onto Blake, who still spoke with the voice of a child. "This is it," he decreed. "Just a little more." He was still saying that by the time her neck ran dry. I maneuvered her body, trying desperately not to throw up. I cut both of wrists and held her in place as the blood flowed. Suddenly, Blake began to bubble. Pustules sprang up and popped all over his body. He expanded, almost entirely enveloping the stump. I stumbled back and let Lucy's body fall. Blake's eyes rolled back into his head and disappeared, along with his teeth. His body had lost all shape now. It was just a black, writhing mass. Two hands pierced the top of the mass and split it open like a satchel. The man began to rise from the black pile, floating up through the air. It was a Native American man. He looked to be in his 60s, although his aura was unknowable old. His legs were covered in intricate symbols of red and white, and he wore a tattered animal hide skirt. Around his neck was a carcanet of beads and feathers. He began speaking in a language I couldn't begin to understand. I only recognized one word: Okeus. He didn't even look at me. He kept rising into the air, past the tree line and further still. I craned my neck and shielded my eyes from the evening sun. The man continued up into the sky until he came to a stop 100 feet or so from the ground. His incantations hastened, and he began to vibrate. Suddenly, he exploded into a cloud of ash, which caught on the wind and fluttered away. I clambered over to the stump, but the black mess had already begun to evaporate. There was no trace of Blake. There was no sign that he'd been there at all. There was nothing. I spent the next few years on the run for murder. My old life died with Lucy. In the past 8 years, I've written this account out dozens of times. It is my admission of guilt. Now, I am finally at peace with it. Make of it what you will and leave me unburdened. I don't know what I let into the world, but there is nothing left I can do. I love you, Blake. I was at the Bayside Marketplace on New Year's Day. To those who don't know, something unexplainable happened that night. Something that the authorities covered up and put off as teens starting a riot. While I wish that were the case, it's far from the truth. I don't know if putting this out there is the best idea, but I can't hold my tongue any longer. You see, I'm a construction worker in the Miami area. While I don't have any children of my own, I have a little sister who means the world to me. She's an honor student with straight A's who's about to go off to university. While I spent my youth staying in trouble, she studied hard. And before she leaves, I wanted to do something nice for her. That evening, when I got off of work, I planned to go to the mall and buy her a nice handbag. Little did I know, something happened there that changed my entire life. As I pulled into the parking lot, the moon shined bright in the sky. Cars were parked as far as the eye could see, though this was nothing new, as places like this constantly stayed packed. I walked in, still wearing my dirty uniform, with my name tag printed on the chest. People filled the floor, shopping and celebrating the new year with friends. I wasn't much of a shopper, so I planned to grab the bag and go. I walked into the store and saw the many purses they had in stock. Some wore price tags that climbed into the tens of thousands. While I did admire my genius little sis, I didn't love her that much. I could feel the eyes on me as I looked around. This place was usually for a higher class of people, but regardless, I found one that was within a reasonable price range. It was white and had one of those famous designers' names embroidered onto it. It seemed perfect for a nice-looking young girl like her. I grabbed it and walked over to the register to pay. The preppy woman had a look in her eye, like she was afraid to touch me. But it didn't matter. I was proud of my sister, and she deserved to be rewarded. After she bagged the purse up, I was ready to leave. But that's when it happened. I saw people running in droves, their faces filled with terror and shock, not looking back no matter what. I walked into the confusion to see what was going on. That's when I saw them. Strange, shadow-like creatures walking through the mall. There were about 5 of them, and they all had to be at least 12 feet tall, all slinking around like creatures from a sci-fi film. With a fight or flight response, I turned to join the crowd in running, dropping my sister's purse like it was yesterday's trash. But as I began running, one of those creatures towered above me. I stood frozen in terror. The entity looked down on me with purple orb-like eyes. Before I knew it, I began to float up into the air. The strange being lifted me high enough to match eyes with it. The smog-like substance it seemed to be made of began flooding my mouth and nose. I thought I was a goner, but oddly enough, I could still breathe. In my head, however, my mind began playing my thoughts like a movie. From my childhood all the way to my adult years, all the good, the bad, I relived it all in a single moment. At first I thought it was my life flashing before my eyes, but I soon realized that this being was watching with me, learning everything it could, even going through my darkest and most vulnerable thoughts. After what seemed like forever, I was placed safely back on the ground. I then stood in shock as the smoky creature slinked away and disappeared, joining the other creatures that had invaded the sprawling shopping center. Once it was over, I sprinted out of the mall, honestly feeling violated and terrified by this whole experience. Outside cop cars lined the streets in an unbelievable turnout. There was no doubt in my mind they had to be preparing for war, in an attempt to protect and drive these horrible invaders away. But sadly, I would be sorely mistaken. As time passed, I began to hear them talking about a riot being started, that a bunch of teenagers were throwing fireworks and fighting. I was naturally confused. There were never any rowdy kids. There weren't any fireworks either. Just ungodly beings not from this world. Why were they trying to hide it? I would attempt to talk to several officers, but they didn't want to hear it. They all blew me off and looked at me like I was insane. After a few days passed, things only got worse. The media had completely blamed this on teenagers, with everyone making jokes about what really happened. I even heard of people's phones being confiscated before videos could be posted. Meanwhile, I had to start going to therapy, as the nightmares I had became unbearable. In my dreams, I would be wandering aimlessly through a barren and cold world. It was filled with the same gigantic smoke-like beings. I watched them creep around, feeling like I was trapped. Every morning I would wake up in a cold sweat, terrified, but thankful that I was at home. I told my therapist about this, but he tried searching for a more logical explanation, saying that maybe I fell and hit my head during all the confusion. But that's not what happened. I will never forget what I saw that day. The media and everyone can believe what they want, but I know what I saw. I've never believed in stuff like this, but it was real, and I fear every day that I might run into one of those things again. Not just that, but I shudder every time I recall that entity invading my mind. If anyone out there isn't afraid, share your story. They can't hide the truth forever. There was a body under my bed, and no one believed me. I was 12 when it happened. While taking inventory of my marble collection, my tiger's eye rolled underneath my bed. Without a second thought, I reached under and felt around. That's when my hand touched hers. At 12, the only hands I had ever held were those of my parents when I was little. Right away, I knew what it was when those cold appendages met mine. I recoiled my hand and backed into the adjacent corner of my room. Once I calmed down, I got on all fours and lowered my face to the floor. The last thing I remembered were those eyes, the most intense blue eyes I had ever seen, even to this day. The next thing I knew, I was waking to the concerned faces of my parents standing over me. My sister, Jill, relayed that I released a blood-curdling scream and passed out right after. Not long after I came to, the memory of what triggered the episode came flooding back. I proclaimed that there was a body under my bed, and of course, like the majority would, my parents thought I was full of shit. They said it was just a bad dream. It's just your imagination. But I was adamant and persistent. They had no choice but to investigate. I sat and waited, huddled on the couch. I covered my ears and closed my eyes to prepare for the scream that I knew would come from my mother. When it didn't come, I held my breath and cracked my lids just enough to see my parents standing before me again. Their expressions were less that of concern and more of annoyance. They scolded me for playing such a silly prank, and that was that. My parents were of the no-nonsense variety, especially my dad. Their irritation with the situation made me question if I truly saw what I thought I saw. For the rest of that evening into the night, I avoided my room. Once bedtime came, I wanted to protest, but the look my father gave me spoke louder than words. With shaky legs and shallow breaths, I stepped into my room. Everything looked normal, felt normal. It even smelled normal. Relief and a healthy dose of exhaustion from the day's events washed over me. I hurriedly changed into my PJs and got snuggled into bed. Sleep came to me easier than expected, however. It was not a restful sleep. The nightmares kept me tossing and turning all night. Those damn blue eyes were on the face of everyone I saw. I ran slow-motion dream style through crowds of people grabbing and pulling at my limbs and clothing. They seemed to be pleading with me for something. I jolted awake, unsure of what time it could have been. The sun hadn't risen yet, so I knew it was still early. I felt a sense of unease in the atmosphere, I knew I had to eventually look again. Better sooner, rather than later, I thought. I opened the drawer on my bedside table and felt around until the familiar shape of my flashlight grazed my fingertips. I gave it a good smack with my palm before turning it on. After giving myself a mental pep talk, in which I concluded that none of this was real, I crawled off my bed and onto the floor. I didn't scream this time, or pass out. I just stared in shock and utter disbelief. There she was, the same blue-eyed woman that was the cause of my insomnia that night, and for many more nights to come. Her body was bloodied and contorted in such a gruesome way, but it was the look of fear and helplessness in her expression that truly bonded me to my spot. Part of me expected this apparition to rapidly cover the short distance between us and consume me, like in the scary movies I wasn't supposed to watch. But she didn't move, blink, or give any indication of life. My stupor finally wore off, and I silently crawled back into my bed. I cried myself to sleep, asking the universe, why me? And trying to understand how I was going to fix this. Later that morning, I awoke, crusty-eyed and groggy, from the crying and lack of sleep. Upon entering the kitchen, I greeted my family, and my mother replied with her back to me as she's still cooking breakfast. It wasn't until my father loudly inquired about what the hell happened to my face that I became the focus of attention. My mother made comments about my crusty, puffy eyelids, while Jill lovingly compared my appearance to that of fecal matter, which earned a very stern glance from our father. Without thought, I explained that it was the woman under my bed. Before I could go into further detail, my father briskly cut me off. My father was a harsh man who didn't like to be challenged. Once he had closed a case, there were no appeals. He dealt me some choice words and made it clear that this nonsense prank I was pulling was to end and end immediately. I don't believe any other words were spoken that morning in our entire household. Everyone just quietly played their roles and went about our days. But while I knew better than to utter another word on the subject in the presence of my father, school was a different matter. Joey, my best friend and confidant, believed me without hesitation, and the brainstorming session was on. She's got to be like some sort of ghost, Joey said, while rubbing his non-existent beard. I had known Joey since kinder, and even at the ripe age of 5, he was a supernatural enthusiast. But I could feel her hand, I replied. He proceeded to explain how not all apparitions are some haunting, ghostly mist. I still didn't understand, but I was willing to accept any explanation more substantial than hallucinations. We, mostly Joey, concluded that she was a lost soul who was stuck on this plane. Why she chose me to appear to, we didn't know. My biggest issues at the time revolved around Pokemon trading cards and video games. I wasn't equipped to help navigate a ghost towards the light, or whatever it was she needed help with. That would not only require mustering the strength to look again, but also finding some kind of way to communicate with her. Should I call a priest or get a Ouija board? Would my parents even allow that? All those thoughts, questions, and more continued to rattle through my brain for the rest of the day. Upon arriving home from school, the silence of our empty house was deafening. I was usually the first one home as both my parents worked until the evening, and my sister had cheerleader practice. My usual after-school routine consisted of having a snack while watching TV for about 30 minutes, then straight to homework. It, as well as my daily chores, were expected to be done by the time my parents arrived home. And believe me, Dad was going to check. But today, I was on a mission. I would have plenty of time for those later. I walked into my room and stood by my bed with all the confidence I could find. I had to figure out what the ghost wanted. I had to help her. After counting down from 10, I dropped to the ground and peered under my bed. In an instant, all the bravado I had moments before was gone. My ghost was still there, in the same contorted position, with the same look of shock and sadness. But her skin had started to dull and turn this sickly gray color. In some places it had begun to sag and droop, giving the impression that it was going to literally fall off the bone, but it was taut and stretched in others, more specifically on her face, which gave her a gaunt, skeletal appearance. I didn't know much about death at that age, but I had found enough dead animals in the woods to know that this was a look of decay. It wasn't much longer after this realization that its sickly, sweet smell hit my nostrils. I dashed to the bathroom, barely clearing the toilet before my lunch reemerged. By the time my sister got home, I had managed to clean up any remnants of my little episode, but that was about all I had accomplished. She immediately questioned me as to why none of my chores were done. "You know Dad is going to lose his shit," she said. And I knew she was right, but I couldn't even go into my room without gagging. It's like the sight of that decaying specter unlocked the smell, and now it was permeating every inch of my room. After explaining how the situation had worsened, I could see the annoyance all over Jill's face. With an exasperated but gentle tone, she said she was going to prove to me once and for all that this was all in my head. She stood and made a beeline for the closed door. I sprinted in front of her and barricaded the door with my arms spread wide. I begged her to leave it shut. The door was barely keeping the stench at bay. I didn't understand how she couldn't smell it, as the odor was still slowly seeping through the small gap at the bottom. My sister hesitated, and at that moment, I could see her irritation turn to concern. Without another word, she walked away. My parents arrived together sometime after 6. We technically didn't have a family car, so my dad would use his work truck to drop off and pick my mom up on his way to and fro. Occasionally, he had far-off jobs, and Mom would catch rides home from a coworker. Those work trips were a blessing to the rest of us, as it meant we would have a few days without tension and chaos. My dad had only been through the door about 30 seconds before his eyes locked onto mine. I swallowed the knot that had formed in my throat the second I heard the car pull into the yard. I tried to get ahead of his anger by word vomiting what was happening and why I had done no chores. I told him about the decaying skin, the horrendous smell, and those ocean blue eyes. In one swift motion, my father grabbed my arm and dragged me to my bedroom door. His mutterings weren't completely audible, but I was able to make out the phrases, "waste of my time," and "idiotic youngin'." These were probably in his top 5 sayings of his lifetime. With a ferocity that we were unfortunate to see on more than one occasion, he swung my door open, nearly ripping it from the hinges. With one hand still gripping my arm, he used the other to lift my bed, frame and all, against the wall. My dad was a naturally large and strong man. Lifting my bed one-handed was easy on a good day. But when he was in a rage, the man probably could move a house. Amongst the violent disarray of my crying and gagging and my father's yelling, I could still see her through my tear-filled eyes, still lying there in her death pose. How could he not see her, smell her? My father pulled me close to his face. He growled through clenched teeth, "If you keep pulling these fucking pranks, There will be a body under this bed, and it will be yours." The house was quiet the rest of the evening, like it always was, after one of my father's extreme outbursts. No one spoke a word for 2 days, the first time he broke a television set. My father wasn't exactly what you would call a loving paternal figure. We never had that traditional all-American father-one-son relationship. From an early age, he had accepted that I didn't possess that same innate aggression as him, and declared me a lost cause. And though the smell radiating from under my bed was insufferable, I knew better than anyone just how deep my father's rage could go. The thought of that was a whole lot scarier than that of the dead ghost girl under my bed. I got little to no sleep that night. I spent the first couple of hours or so gagging and fighting back the urge to expel what little food I had in my stomach. Once, I had acclimated to the putrid smell. It was the quiet sobbing that kept me from sleep. I would cry and cry until I eventually fell asleep, only to be plagued by nightmares of the face that lay below me. I would wake, soaked in sweat and tears, only to start the whole process over. Unfortunately, this was my new normal. Tossing, turning, gagging, and crying all night, followed by complete exhaustion the next day. The lack of sleep was obvious to my family, but no one dared approach the subject, fearing my father's rage. I would occasionally check in on the state of my corpse apparition bunkmate. She continued to disgustingly wither away right before my eyes. I remember thinking I would start to resemble a corpse, myself, at this rate. And though the sight was gruesome, I had the thought that maybe she would completely decay and dissolve into nothingness. During this time, my nightmares became more vivid. I would see her running in the woods, not jogging, but running in fear. It was like some kind of horror movie. I could feel her fear as she frantically dodged limbs and other forest debris. She would glance back at whoever or whatever she was running from. The look of pure desperation she displayed haunts me more than anything else. The only time I had seen real fear like that before was on TV or in the eyes of my family, when my father had one of his more extreme outbursts. It was the fear of knowing something bad was going to happen, and that there was absolutely nothing in this world you could do to stop it. As the nights progressed, so did the dreams. Eventually, her pursuer caught up to her. I will spare you the details of her demise, though it came in the form of a sickening, twisted nightmare. Something told me those scenes were too graphic to not be real, and this woman chose to appear to me. She chose to show me these events, but why? What could I do? I started checking the local news websites to see if anyone who looked like her was missing or murdered, but I found nothing. I had started to think that this predicament would end with me withering and perishing away right along with her. Every day I could see the worry in my mother's eyes, but one sharp glance from my father was enough to make the hardest of men shiver. My mother was a small, meek woman who did what her husband told her, at least to his face. Many nights I was supposed to be deprived of dinner, but she would always manage to sneak me a plate in the wee hours of the morning. She saved me many times, in more ways than one. After what felt like years, it all ended on one bright, sunny day. I hadn't checked on my specter in a while. By this point, she wasn't much more than a skeleton. The only thing that seemed to resist death's grip was her face. The blue of those eyes never faded. I prepared myself to see that familiar gaze once again, only to find myself looking at a water bottle, a pair of socks, and a baseball mitt. She was gone. I felt a bit of relief, but I felt sadness more than anything. I knew what I had been seeing and experiencing was real. Though I had no proof in those moments, I knew she was real, and I knew what she went through was real, and I hurt for her. No human should go through the atrocities this woman suffered. My family was never religious, but in that moment I prayed that she was at peace. As the day progressed, the immense sadness I felt upon discovering that my specter's departure began to fade. It was replaced with what I can only describe as deep anxiety. I didn't understand why I felt anxious and on edge, especially since it seemed that my ordeal was over. However, shortly after the lunch period, my life, took a turn I never expected. My principal, Mr. Cash, came to retrieve me from my classroom, with no disclaimer as to what prompted the trip to his office. I wasn't an angel by any means, but I had managed to never land myself in that hot seat, not even once. During the deafeningly quiet 2-minute walk, I tried to recall anything I could have done to get myself in trouble. It wasn't until he opened the door and I saw the worried face of my sister that I knew the trouble didn't lie with me. Our principal, who was normally a cheerful man, wore an expression that told me no good news was to come from there on out. He informed us that there had been an incident, and our aunt was on her way to pick us up. Jill instantly began to weep. I didn't grasp what was happening. Why weren't our parents coming to get us? Were they hurt? Was Mom hurt? Did my dad hurt her? Mr. Cash stood up and began to walk towards his office door. He paused beside me momentarily and placed his hand on my shoulder. Without another word, he left us to wait. In between my sister's low sobs, I could hear my heart pounding. The thumping seemed to grow louder as each agonizing second ticked on. It then transitioned to a ringing in my ears. As the ringing was about to reach a fever pitch, the door swung open, revealing my aunt. My aunt wouldn't tell us much. She confirmed that, while our parents weren't hurt, there was an incident, and my mother, my sister, and I would be staying with her for a bit. This statement unleashed a whole new round of questioning. Despite our persistence, our aunt made it clear that my mother had all the answers. Upon arriving at our aunt's house, we found our mother sitting blank-faced and stoic on the couch. You could tell from the puffiness and redness of her eyes that she had been weeping. She immediately outstretched her arms, and we melted into them. I still didn't know what terrible thing had happened, but I knew I was happy to be in my mother's arms. After our meaningful embrace, my sister and I each took a seat on either side of our mother as she firmly grasped our hands. She solemnly looked from me to my sister before she began. "Your father did a very, very bad thing, and he won't be coming home anytime soon, if ever," she said, as her voice began to crack. She proceeded to reveal to us that our father had murdered a woman, a state over while he was on one of his supposed work trips. Mother didn't go into much detail to try to spare us some trauma, to prevent us from stumbling upon the gruesome facts of it all. We weren't allowed to watch cable or access the internet. We were told we would be taking the rest of the week off of school, maybe longer. This would normally be a 12-year-old's dream, but this felt more like a hellscape. That night, after everyone else had made peace with the Sandman, I crept into the living room and tuned into the local news station. It wasn't long before I saw her. Plastered on the screen, dressed in her jet black cap and gown, was my ghost girl, Anna Elizabeth Collins. She was 19, not much older than my sister. Anna had fallen in with the wrong crowd shortly after graduating high school. She often caught rides with strangers as a means of getting around. Her body had been found by some hikers out in the woods. Our father and his work truck fit the description of the man seen giving her a ride. Police followed him for weeks, waiting for him to slip up. They retrieved DNA from a cigarette he had tossed on the ground. It was a match not just for Anna, but for 2 other unsolved missing persons cases. As I stared into those baby blues, I felt tranquility I had never felt before. Though Anna had suffered greatly at the hands of my father, I somehow knew she was at rest now. I turned off the TV and lay on the couch until I drifted off to sleep. That night, there was no gagging, tossing and turning, or nightmares. That night, I dreamt I was standing in the middle of my room. Anna appeared in my doorway, but not as the mangled corpse I was used to, but how she looked in the photos and videos on the news. Her face was serene and angelic. She glided across the room as the light of her aura filled the entire space around us. She placed a hand on each of my shoulders and gently pulled me into an embrace. I knew that life was going to be very different for my family and me after this. But in that moment, I knew we would eventually be okay. On the 25th of November 2018, the victim pulled into a budget motel in the early hours of the morning. He booked room 12 for a 3-day stay, and on the 4th day, the owner of the establishment sent his son to check on the victim. What he found was something that someone his age should never have witnessed, or anyone for that matter. By the time I arrived at the scene, it had already been cordoned off. Members of the county police department had swarmed the area, and in the absence of the sun, it was the blue and red flashing lights that cast their glow over the building. I made my way past the tenants who were half asleep, doing their best at giving witness testimonial. I stepped by a particularly shaken forensic pathologist who was trying to call his mother and entered room 12. Now, I've been working as a crime scene investigator for more than 20 years. I have dealt with some truly confounding scenes before. In 2006, a body of a missing hiker was found in the woods just on the county line. It had been burnt to a crisp, but only the upper half. Below the waist was completely untouched, as was the surrounding area. More recently, a farmer reported a break-in just after New Year's Eve. Presumably, someone had broken into his warehouse, which housed an industrial animal carcass shredder. It had been used in the night, and a pile of jellied flesh was found clumped at its mouth. Horrifically, it was eventually proven to be human, although couldn't be identified beyond that. Only one other thing was found at the scene. Within the remains was a small steel plaque about the size of a business card, with the number 002916 engraved in it. I say all this for simple context. I'm no stranger to the unexplainable, but what I saw in room 12 still keeps me up at night. Following are excerpts from the crime scene report I filed that day. Incident number 240711. Date of incident November 29th, 2018. Time of arrival 11:54 p.m. Location Room 12, Sir Sleep-A-Lot Motel, Yellow Smoke County. Reporting Officer Detective Arthur Graham, Yellow Smoke County Police Department. Victim name John Doe. Name yet to be confirmed through fingerprint or DNA. Gender male. Age estimated to be mid-40s. Occupation unknown. Suspects None at present. The victim checked into the Sir Sleep-A-Lot Motel on the morning of November 25th, 2018. He informed the motel owner, Mr. John Kelly, that he would be staying for 3 days. No known associates or visitors during the stay. Victim was found laying on bed in supine position. Victim had skin removed crudely. Patches of flesh hang loosely, revealing bone in some areas. Teeth indents on right part of pelvic bone will be examined. The victim's head is absent from the scene. Notably, the body had been dressed in what appeared to be women's undergarments, specifically a pair of lace stockings and a torn satin slip. Neither items of clothing belonged to the victim. The body was likely dressed post-mortem. Addendum: marks on right part of pelvic bone were positively identified as being from a human juvenile, estimated as between the ages of 3 and 6. No dental record have been traced. Blood covers every inch of the room's 4 walls and carpet. The blood spray appears to be inconsistent with splatter from traumatic injury, possible use of pressurized device. The amount of blood was determined to be approximately 2 gallons, or 135% of the victim's total volume. Teeth were found on the room's desk, 33 in total, arranged into a circular pattern 10 inches in diameter. The careful arrangement appears to be ritualistic. The teeth are currently assumed to have been belonging to the victim. The location of the victim's head has not been identified. Addendum: the findings of the forensic odontologist have determined that 32 of the 33 teeth belonged to a person matching the victim's description, a Caucasian male in his 40s. One of the teeth matches a younger Caucasian female. It was eventually connected through dental records to be from 24-year-old Alyssa Hadland, reported missing in 1997. The Hadland case was archived in 1999 due to absence of evidence. The victim's tongue was discovered in the bathroom sink, exhibiting a complete severance at the base. The incision appeared clean and precise, suggesting the use of a surgical grade or extremely sharp cutting instrument. Notably, the tongue was found in isolation within the sink, devoid of any other biological material, indicating that it may have been intentionally relocated post-excision. First responders noted signs of tampering on the coin-operated television in the room, which intermittently activated to static approximately once an hour. The television will be deconstructed for forensic examination to recover latent fingerprints and other trace evidence related to its manipulation. Addendum: both of the victim's eyes were recovered from the interior of the room's coin-operated television. The television screen had been removed, and the eyes were placed within the cavity where the cathode ray tube was situated. This positioning suggests deliberate placement, indicating a possible symbolic motive. The only item of clothing found at the scene belonging to the victim was one pair of denim jeans, which witness John Kelly recalls being worn by the victim the morning he checked in. The jeans were contaminated with the victim's blood. In the pockets were found a one-way bus ticket from the towns of Cosgrave to Mayor's Income, one packet of apple-flavored gum, and a button. No other possessions of the victim were found. A pair of small leather lace-up shoes were found at the foot of the bed. From the lack of bloodstains, we can assume the shoes were placed there after the homicide. Addendum A: a shirt likely belonging to the victim was found 3 weeks later, partially buried in a field in San Tommaso, a small town 240 miles south of Yellow Smoke. The shirt matched the description given by John Kelly of the victim. Blood samples taken from the shirt were a strong match to those taken from the crime scene, although Without the identity of the victim, a definitive link is challenging to corroborate. Addendum B. The small shoes found at the crime scene were dated to 1909 and determined to have some value among antique dealers. Due to their small size, they can be assumed to be children's shoes. The room showed no obvious signs of damage. The furniture appeared to have been undisturbed, although a Bible was missing from the bedside cabinet. Neither John Kelly nor his son David, lead witnesses of the case, recall seeing the victim with any luggage. For this reason, it is unclear if his possessions were taken or if he simply had none to begin with. The motive of this homicide remains unclear. I'll save you the rest of the procedural formalities. I've lost track of how many nights I've spent awake, staring at my computer screen, reading and rereading this report. It stayed with me for the past 6 years, constantly at the back of mind. At my personal behest, the case remained open, despite insufficient evidence and a complete lack of any leads. When it was finally shelved at the beginning of this year, they were no closer to solving it than we were the day we found him. Earlier this week, I learned that it had been reopened by the FBI. I assumed that there must be someone else in this department who felt the same way about the case as I did, strong enough to reach out and request assistance from the feds. I was tasked with compiling any and all digital evidence we had on the case onto a USB flash. I felt weird combing through all the reports, files, and forensics. It felt like I was visiting an old friend. I added the documents I wrote up on the day, the dozens of crime scene photos and witness statements. I've studied them all meticulously myself. I doubted some Yale boy with a corner office could do any better. I kept trailing through the earmarked files, checking and double-checking if there was anything I'd missed. It was dark now. I spent the day working from home, hunched over my computer and my sorry excuse for a library. That's what my job mostly consists of now. I couldn't wait for retirement. Maybe then I would have the time to read some of these books I have lying around. I decided I was finished for the night. I'd squeezed every piece of relevant information I could find onto that hard drive. It was up to the FBI now. I only hoped that if our victim left any family behind, they could one day get some closure from this. I was about to shut my computer down when something caught my eye. Witness Floodland MP3. It was an audio file. Somehow I hadn't noticed it before. Hell, I don't think I had even listened to it before. To my knowledge, all the witness statements taken that night were written. I clicked on it, figuring it must have been taken from David Kelly, the kid who'd found the body. I took a sip of my last dregs of coffee and sat back in my chair, jacking up the volume. The audio wasn't the best quality. It was shrouded in the static of an analog recording, and to my shock, the supposed first witness had a woman's voice. The following is a transcript of what was on that file. First responder. What were you doing in the area before you discovered the body? Witness 1. I'm staying in room 14, the room next door to where it happened. Been there for the past 2 weeks, thereabouts. I've come on hard times recently. You know how it is. I was living out of a van until this, but it wasn't exactly reliable. First responder. Apologies, ma'am. I meant, what were you doing immediately before discovering the body? Witness 1. Right. Well, I came back from work around 9. I clean at the elementary school in town. I came back and spent the rest of the day in my room. I had dinner, and I was just catching up with the news before I went to sleep. First responder. Can you describe how and when you found the body? Witness 1. Gee, it must have been around 10. I was turning in for the night when I heard a banging noise from next door. I guessed he must have brought a lady friend over, so I tried my best to ignore it. But it kept getting louder. Didn't sound like a headboard neither, more like someone chopping wood. It was too much for me to ignore, so I got up to go complain. I found the door unlocked, and it opened wide up when I knocked. That's when I saw him, that poor, poor man. First responder, could you please describe the scene you came across as detailed as you can? Witness 1. It was terrible. Just terrible. I saw my neighbor kneeling in the corner of his room. His head had been cut off. Can you imagine that? There was blood covering everything around him. I almost vomited there and then. Then I saw the man in the bathroom. There's a pause. First responder, could you please go on? You said there was someone else at the scene? Witness 1. Yeah, a real weirdo. I didn't notice him at first. He was just peeking out from behind the bathroom door, watching me. When I did finally notice him, we just stared at each other for a moment or two. Then he just strolled out from his little hiding place. Another pause. First responder, please continue. I assure you everything you have to say will be of some importance to our investigation. Start by describing this man you saw. Witness 1. Okay then, he was a freak, I'll say it. When I got a good look at him, I saw that he had this great bulbous head. He was bald as a newborn, and the entire back part of his head was all deformed and sagging down. I think he had this disease. Oh, what's it called? A boy I went to school with had it. First responder, are you thinking of hydrocephalus? Witness 1. Yes. Yeah, that's it. Hydrocephalus. But it was much worse than that kid I knew. Sorry if I'm coming across as rude, but it looked like some horrible octopus. And the front part of his head was far too thin. He has this pointy chin and cheekbones. His eyes were as bulging as his skull. All yellow and white. I think he had cataracts. Oh, and he must have been around 7 feet tall at least. He was hunching over where he met the ceiling. First responder, can you describe what he was wearing? Witness 1. Sure, he had this battered old duster coat on. It was black, but he was covered in these stitched rags of red and green. The coat hung down to the floor, but I could make out the tips of brown leather boots poking out from the hem. First responder, can you... Witness 1. Oh, pardon my interrupting, but the man, he was holding this... Well, I don't know what it was. It looked like a lobster pot with a handle, and must be 24 blades sticking out of it. Knives, mostly, and razor blades, axe heads, chains, that sort of stuff. Anyway, go on. First responder. Right. What did you do when he came closer to you? Witness 1. Well, I ran. I just ran. Out of the motel and down the road until I realized everything I owned was in my room. I didn't fancy having to start over from nothing for a third time, so I came back, and that's when you bumped into me. First responder. All right. And how long was it from discovering the body until you called 911? Witness 1. Oh, I didn't call 911, honey. First responder. You didn't? Witness 1. Oh no, by the time I came back from my little jog, the place was already crawling with police. I still haven't been allowed back in my room. First responder. Are you aware that... End. His speech became muffled after that. until the recording was nothing but static hum that had been in the background since the beginning. After hearing this for the first time, I didn't know what to think. I just sat in my old oak chair until my wife came in to tell me that she was going to bed. I kissed her goodnight and went back to aimlessly staring at the computer screen. Eventually, I closed it and stood up. I took the USB stick and left it on my desk. I left the room and locked the door behind me. I changed, washed, and climbed into bed with my wife. I kissed her on the back of her neck and tried to fall asleep. That thing that did this was still out there, but that wasn't my problem anymore. For most of my years, I'd been dragged around by the twin steeds of addiction and crime without a thought beyond my next fix. Then I was arrested. That was the wake-up call I needed. Once I was inside, I had to deal with my addiction with both therapy and forced sobriety. It wasn't easy. During my lowest moment, vomiting into a prison toilet, I found something I thought I had lost: hope. I came out the other side of my stint, healthier and ready to take my life in a new direction. Prison had been the tough love I needed. I was ready for the free world again. I soon discovered the free world wasn't ready for me. Part of my release agreement was that I needed to find steady employment. I thought that sounded simple enough, but I had no idea how cruel the world could be to anyone who colored outside life's lines. Despite being capable, willing, and reformed, no one wanted to hire me. My parole officer told me not to stress because he knew a few people who might be able to help. He saw that I was trying and made a few phone calls. He hooked me up with Pete, a good dude who owned a junk removal company named Moving Buddies. "Been out long?" he asked when I sat with him. "About a month." "How did the family take it?" "Don't have one to lean on anymore," I said. "Part of the reason I ended up where I ended up, you know?" "I understand," Pete said. "We all deal with grief in our own way." "Most of those ways don't end in jail time," I said. "No, they do not. But it brought you back from the dead and to my doorstep. I'd say that's a win-win." Less than 2 days later, Pete hired me, and I was ready to go. Despite the name, Moving Buddies was not a moving company in the traditional sense. It was a junk removal company that specialized in cleaning up evictions and hoarder homes. It was long, back-breaking work, but it kept me busy. I welcomed the distraction. I wasn't even the only former con on the team. My partner and driver, Devin Baker, or D as he liked to be called, had also done time in his past. We chatted about it the first day, and it bonded us. Like me, he had gone in for armed robbery, but he had received more time. Like me, he struggled once he got out. He took this job out of desperation too, but he said it saved his life. "I mean, don't get me wrong, it sucks," he said, as we drove to our new job. "But it's better than fucking jail, you know? Plus, Pete's not a bad guy. Tight as a dolphin's asshole with money, but he gets the life. He'll cut you some slack." I was starting to think people like that didn't exist. "Nobody loves ex-cons," he said. "Wait until you start up with the dating apps. You're gonna really feel the hate then." I laughed. "Who'd hate a cuddly teddy bear like you, D?" He laughed. "That's what I'm saying. But it's cold out there, brother. Ice cold." We were headed out to our gig for the day. Some old fart had passed and left a mess for his kids. I hated hoarder homes because there was always some extra bullshit hidden in the piles. You could not imagine smells. They stick with you hours after your shift. We've found dead pets and living wild animals in some homes. Never a dull moment. We arrived and were greeted by an exhausted-looking man in his late 40s. He was the son of the dead guy and told us what we already knew from the work order. I felt sympathy for him. He inherited a huge mess. Sorry about how it looks. Dad went, well, crazy in the last few years. All he talked about was conspiracies and people out to get him and he caught himself. He changed, you know? Then he let this place turn into this. Not unusual in our line of work, I said, trying to comfort him. Believe it or not, this isn't even the worst we've ever seen, Dee added. That seemed to ease the man's mind, and he left us to do our work. Dee sidled up to me as he left and nodded at the house. Yo, this is the worst fucking house I've ever seen. Easy. When we finally cracked the tomb seal, the full brunt of the smell hit us like the concussive wave of an atomic bomb. A potent combination of death, rotting food, and vomit stung our nostrils. Dee wasn't lying. This was the worst ever. Let's have a smoke before we get hip deep in this shit, Dee said, pulling out his vape. Agreed, I said, pulling out my crinkled pack of Marlboro Reds and Naked Lady Bic. Those'll kill you, man, Dee said, nodding at my pack of cigarettes. Those chemicals won't? Shit, he said, exhaling a massive puff of vapor. I didn't say all that now. We finished our smokes and steadied ourselves. We wiped Vapo Rub under our noses and opened the door. The entryway was crammed with old garbage. The house had so many flies that I thought it might get yanked from its foundation and take to the air. The old man may have died, but there was still some life inside this place. Goddamn, Dee said. How did the city not condemn this place? Maybe he knew people in high places. Should have met a garbage man, he said, getting to work. Hoarders were the worst. What they all have in common is some sort of mental break that sets them on this course. I've found it's often associated with some kind of loss. A job, a spouse, a child. They compensate for their loss by trying to save anything that could be important or that they could use later. They never do. Thus, you get homes stuffed with towering monuments to our disposable culture. The hell? Dee said, from a corner of the living room. I walked over to him and looked down at the ground where he was pointing. It's trash, I said. Under the bag, man. I moved the bag and nearly vomited. Under the bag, remains of two very dead cats. They looked like they'd recently died, but were under a few ancient garbage bags. I saw a wrapper for a McDLT in one bag, and they stopped selling that in the 90s. You didn't know those were cats? I know they're cats. Look at their backs. I did, and that's when I saw what looked like a bite mark on the remains. Something with razor-sharp teeth had chomped some of the spines away. You'd miss it if you quickly glanced at the remains, but when you looked at them, you could clearly see the bite marks. What the hell did that? I asked. That looks like a lion bite, bro, Dee said, shaken up. If we find a lion in here, I'm gone, I joked. It may not be hungry, though, considering he seemed to have recently had a snack. Shit's not funny, Dee said. I have two cats, Scooby and Shaggy. My bad, I said. Did this old man put them there? Dee asked. Because this is some old-ass garbage, and those are recently dead. Maybe whatever ate them dragged them here. Want me to remove them? I asked, but didn't wait for his response. As I went to bag up the cats, we heard something skitter on the floor behind us. We both turned around, and a few trash bags rolled off a pile and spilled on the floor. If there is actually a fucking lion in here, I swear to God, I whispered. Shh, Dee said, his eyes scanning the room. We both looked around for the source of the noise, but didn't see anything. I was about to say something when we heard more scrambling off to our left. I rushed over, moved away a few bags, and let out a terrified, high-pitched scream. After the initial shock, I started laughing. What? Dee asked. I reached down and pulled up a beat-up jester doll buried in the stacks. Its porcelain face had split down the middle at some point, and the left side was gone. The right side's painted face had worn away, with time and exposure to garbage juice. But one unblinking eye stared out at us. Its long limbs hung toward the ground, hunched over like it had a bad back. Who would want this? I asked. Weird fucking hoarders. We heard skittering again, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw a massive rat run from under some old cardboard boxes and back towards the bedrooms. I dropped the doll and chased after it, but it was gone before I could do anything. Dee shook his head. Be careful when we're grabbing shit, he said. Those things will take off the tip of your fingers. I grabbed the doll and propped it up on the pile of trash, so it looked like it was sitting on a throne of garbage. I'll hire the jester to look out for us. It needs a name. What about Trashly? As soon as I said it, the doll's heavy limbs made it slump to its side. Dee laughed. Trashly already sleeping on the job. We went back to work. We set about clearing out the living room and kitchen before we moved on to the closets and pantries in those rooms. Closets were the worst part of a hoarder's home. They crammed closets full of the weirdest shit known to man. Once, we pulled 8 taxidermied animals out of a living room closet. It was a nativity scene. Baby Jesus was a stuffed dormouse. We played rock, paper, scissors, and Dee lost. He had one closet duty. I set back to clearing out the living room, leading towards the hallway, and let Dee work on the closet. Dee had moved out 3 garbage bags when I heard him yell and fall out of the closet. I ran over to him as he was scooting away from the closet door. He was genuinely spooked. I helped him up and asked him what happened. It took him a second to put his thoughts together. Something touched me. What? I swear to God, man. Something reached out and touched my hand. It was probably, I said, before he cut me off. Bitch, I know what a hand feels like. A fucking hand touched my arm. Okay, I said. Gonna let the bitch comment slide. My bad, man, he said, shaking his head. But that shit ain't never fucking happened to me before. You got a flashlight? Let's take a look. In the truck, he said. I'll go grab it. He left, and I shook my head. I was working under the belief that he had touched a rat's tail or something. Rats loved the stink of trash, but people tended to avoid it. The smell in this place would keep Oscar the Grouch at arm's length. From behind me, I heard the rats scrambling around. I went over to where I had heard the noise, but didn't see anything. Dee came back into the house and saw me looking for the rat. Heard something? He asked. I think we may have a few friends watching us, I said, glancing through the garbage piles. Can I see that flashlight? He handed it to me, and I shined the beam into the sea of living room trash bags. Nothing jumped out at me, so I assumed the rats were adept at hiding from humans. Something did catch my eye, though. Trashly. The doll wasn't in the place where I had left it. Maybe it had fallen during the closet panic, and I hadn't noticed. I plucked up the doll again. "It might have been our jester friend here," I said, "and not the rats." "I don't like that doll," Dee said. "Reminds me of Poltergeist, the fucking clown thing. Man, that messed me up good." "Maybe we should put a tracker on it," I joked. Dee didn't laugh. "Good idea." He eyed something on the ground and grabbed it. "Put this on it." He handed me an old cat collar with a little bell on it. I gave him a look, but he insisted. I dutifully put it around Trashly's neck and gave it a shake. The bell jingled, and Dee looked satisfied. I put Trashelly back on the trash pile throne and handed Dee back the flashlight. "Let's go see about your closet hand." I walked over and pulled the closet door back open. "Hey," I said to the potential person in the closet, "we're gonna empty that closet. If you want to get out of here without the two of us stomping you, I'd leave now." Nothing happened. I wasn't surprised. It's not that I doubted Dee. If anything, the dude was honest to a fault. But the story was so far-fetched. There's no way anyone could be in there. But still, Dee is honest. If he felt a hand, he might have felt a hand. "You gonna feel around in there or what?" he asked me. I said, "Let's look." "You gotta feel too," I felt. "I didn't agree to that," I protested. "Neither did I, but here we are," he said. "Don't make me pull rank." I wasn't going to win. The only thing left to do would be to stick my arm into the garbage closet, hoping that a phantom hand wouldn't grab my arm. What the fuck even was this job? Dee shined the light into the darkness. 2 bags fell and split open on the floor. One was filled with maggots. I looked back at Dee. "If I'm sticking my hand in there, you're picking up the creepy crawlies." "Fine," he said. "Now, come on, man. Let's do this." I sighed and reached into the closet. It was packed with smelly garbage bags, and the old owner had also heaped in a bunch of raggedy blankets to fill the gaps between the bags. I slid my arm into a tar-black opening and felt around in the darkness. How long do I need to feel around for a hand? "Bro, just do me a solid, huh? I need to know I'm not crazy." I pushed my arm deeper into the hole and felt around the trash bags. I half expected Dee to laugh and tell me this was some elaborate prank he was pulling. But when I glanced back at him, he intently watched me. There was real fear in his eyes, a thing I didn't think I'd ever see out of him. I don't think... My hand brushed against something long and pointy, like a finger. My eyes bugged open, because Dee ran closer with the flashlight. "You feel it, don't you?" I did feel it. It was a hand. I reached around, found the wrist, and pulled as hard as possible. All the bags around me started to roll, and before I knew it, my force sent me falling back on my ass. The rank garbage rained all over me, but I still held onto that arm. I pushed the bags off myself, maggots landing on my face and hair, and stood up. Dee dropped the flashlight and was doubled over with laughter. I looked down at my hand and saw why. I was holding an arm, but it didn't belong to a man or some creature. It was a mannequin arm. I threw it down with disgust and shook all the creepy crawlies off me. Dee had dropped to the floor, barely able to breathe. I was hot. This job was bad enough, and now, this. Did you fucking know it was a mannequin arm? "I swear," I swear I didn't, man. But that shit is funny as fuck. Dee has the kind of laugh that can bring anyone around to join him. Not long after, I fell under the spell of his piped piper chuckles. I threw the arm at him, and he caught it. He helped me off the ground and apologized between the laughs. He patted my back with the arms and started cracking up again. I hurled the arm across the room. That's when we heard Trashy's bells ringing. We looked to where I had left the jester, but it wasn't there anymore. Dee and I locked eyes. We both wanted to speak, but found our ability to do so gone as if we had violated an agreement with Ursula, the sea witch. We heard the little bell jingling again, this time coming from one of the back rooms. How? Was all Dee could push out. Rats, I said. Has to be. Why are the rats taking the doll? Boom! The closet door behind us slammed shut. We both jumped, and when Dee's feet hit the ground, he sprinted out the front door. I wanted to join him, but I caught a shadow moving along the wall leading to the kitchen and turned to it. In my peripheral vision, it looked like something with long limbs skulking into the kitchen. The bell started ringing again. It was still in the bedrooms. He? Hello? I called out. Nobody answered. I took a step toward the crowded hallway that led to the back bedrooms. Is anyone there? This time, there was the sound of something moving in the kitchen. Unlike the quick skittering we had heard previously, this was someone moving slowly and deliberately. Someone trying not to make any noise. They were either trying to hide from me or stalk me. Neither idea sparked joy. Bro, I'm sorry, Dee said, peering in from the front door. I didn't mean to run away like a little kid, man. I turned to him and put my fingers to my lips to shush him. He nodded, and I pointed toward the kitchen. He wearily inched back into the house, whipping his head around to see if anything around him was out of the ordinary. Feeling assured he was safe, he crept in, but kept the flashlight in his hand, cocked and ready to swing. The bell started dinging again in the back room. I pointed towards myself and then the back rooms. Dee nodded, but he wasn't going to join me back there. I wasn't even sure I could make my way back there as quietly as I wanted. There was a small path between the piles of trash, and I was too big for it. I was sure I'd make a racket cutting through, giving whoever was back there a fair warning that someone was coming. Regardless, I was going to try. As I took my first step, we heard something moving in the kitchen again. This time, Dee saw the same shadow I had. He mimed to me that he thought a man was in there and that he was going to head that way. I delayed my trip to the back bedrooms and hung back just in case he needed some help. Still, after the adrenaline of the moment passed, I had second thoughts about going to the back bedrooms alone. It seemed like the kind of decision a dumb character would make in a slasher movie. I may not be smart, but I ain't that dumb either. I quietly stepped toward the kitchen, flanking Dee as he approached. We heard the cabinet doors open and slam close. There was more movement on the floor as well. It sounded like more than one rat. Then the strangest noise came out of there. The jingling of a bell. Someone threw a trash bag toward the living room as we stood there. It landed with a wet splat and spilled the rotten innards across the floor. The food in the bag was so old, it had melted into a putrid black ooze. It sprayed onto Dee's pants. "You about to get fucked up," Dee yelled. He rushed into the kitchen, flashlight held high, ready to crown the bag tosser. I ran behind him. believing a show of force might deter whoever was in there. But when we entered the room, there wasn't a person in there. We saw 2 rats running along the counters, but no lanky-limbed person. The rats squealed, dove into the trash pile, and disappeared from our view. Dee looked over at me and shook his head. "There was someone in here, man. Those damn rats didn't throw that bag." "Can I help you, gentlemen?" came a voice from the front door. Dee and I turned to see a nicely dressed, middle-aged white guy standing there. His fake but friendly smile was plastered on his face and didn't present any immediate threat. With this job, you always get looky-loos who want to see how demented their neighbor had been, but they rarely walk into the house. Considering everything that had happened up to this point, the Pope could show up, and we'd be leery. "You can't be in here, man," Dee said. "I'm always here," the man said. "Well, then your streak ends today," Dee said, keeping calm. "This is a job site now, and isn't safe for the general public." The man started laughing. "I'm not the general public." "Did you know the man that lived here?" I asked. "In a sense. I watched him for years," the stranger said. "He made many poor decisions. Strange person." "Well, he's not even a person anymore," Dee said, his tone shifting. "He's passed on and left us this mess to clean up. Since we're in control of the site, we can ask you to leave. If you get hurt, we can get sued. If we get sued, I get fired. I get fired, my landlord kicks me out of my place, and I have to live in my car. Since I'm not trying to live out of my beater, you have to go, sir. You live off Baltimore Avenue, right?" Dee's face dropped. He did live near there. But how did this guy know that? Dee squared up and took a more aggressive posture. "Who are you?" Dee asked. "You work with Pete?" "I know Pete," he said, "but he's never met me." "What the hell does that mean?" "Yeah," I said. "You're speaking in riddles. Just tell us who you are and what you want." Before the man could speak, we heard Trashley's bell jingling again. This time, it was coming from inside the kitchen, despite my having heard it in the back bedroom just minutes earlier. How did it get into the kitchen? Dee and I turned back and saw a rat run across the floor, with a cat collar around its neck. "Was that the collar on Trashley?" I asked. "Yeah," Dee said. We heard the jingling as the rat dove into the sea of trash bags and disappeared from sight. Then, it went quiet again. "Where is the doll?" I asked. We returned to where the stranger had been standing, but he was gone. I glanced back toward the front door and saw it swinging on its hinges. I looked at Dee and shrugged. As weird as that dude was, he was gone now. "Who the fuck was that?" "How did he know where I lived?" Dee said. "What the hell is going on, man?" There was more jingling in the kitchen again. We turned away from the open front door and back to the noise. Dee and I entered the garbage-stuffed room and scanned for the bell's location. It rang a few more times, but stopped as suddenly as it started. I elbowed Dee in the ribs and nodded at the kitchen window. It was mostly covered with old shoeboxes and a ratty old curtain, but you could see shadows moving outside. We saw the stranger pass by the window, heading toward the back door. We waited a beat, and then the door handle started shaking, like he was trying to get in. The door must have been locked because he didn't open it. Dee was beginning to get frustrated and yelled out, "Hey man, you gotta get the fuck out now, okay?" The man stopped but didn't walk away. You could still see him outside in the curtain. Dee, thoroughly annoyed at this point, marched through the trash and ripped open the curtain on the back door. instead of seeing the man standing there, though. We saw nothing but the waist-high grass in the backyard. "What the—" Dee mumbled and let go of the curtain. You could see the stranger's outline again when it swung back into place. I audibly gasped, and Dee grabbed the curtain and yanked it away again. Again, there was nothing but grass waving in the breeze. "How?" I said. Before Dee could respond, one of the cabinet doors swung open and Trashley spilled out. The doll landed with a thud on the counter. We watched the lifeless rag doll as it lay on the ugly formica and waited for it to move again. As if it read our thoughts, the doll's left arm fell and dangled off the edge. That was enough to drive us both out of the kitchen. As we returned to the living room, the front door opened again. The stranger had come back. Dee walked up to him and got into the man's face. I ran over and put an arm on Dee's shoulder, but he shrugged me off. "Who the hell are you, man? What are you doing here?" "I came to check on this place and see if things were in order. You two seem to be the perfect men for the job." "Did Pete send you?" I asked. "Did you know the guy that owned this place?" "He was one of the people we monitored. He was meddling with things beyond his control, and he paid for that curiosity." "You killed him?" "No. He awakened something he shouldn't have. He paid for that decision. I came to witness this." "Witness what?" "Maybe we should call Pete," I said. "Get this straightened out." "I didn't know dolls could stand like that," the stranger said, pointing toward the kitchen. We both snapped our heads back toward the kitchen and saw Trashley standing tall on its thin fabric legs. It didn't move, but it was clear it had moved at some point. It was in a small pile on the counter when we last saw it. The whole energy in the house had changed in an unnatural direction, like seeing watch hands run backward. Dee's eyes were so wide I was afraid they'd pop out. He was gripping the flashlight so tight, I thought he might shatter it. Drops of sweat formed on his bald head and rolled down his face. He wasn't a tiny man, and I was worried these scares might cause his heart to stop. Confusion is too weak a word to describe what we felt in the moment. Befuddlement, maybe, like discovering there had been aliens on Earth this whole time, and your boss was one of them. As we stared, the stranger said, "I think now you have a real mess on your hands." "I think I'm about to beat your ass," Dee said, turning to confront the man, but not finding him standing there. "What the hell? Where did he go?" There was a rumble of thunder, and it shook the house. Dee and I both ducked, like something was going to fall on us. I felt the thunderclap's vibrations in my guts. I glanced at the windows and noticed the sun still peeking through the edges of the blackout curtains. There were no clouds overhead, and I realized that the thunderclap didn't come from above us, but from below. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words died in my throat when we heard something knocking inside the closed closet door. It was quiet initially, but each successive thump was louder than the last. Soon the knocks were so loud and so violent, the doorknob rattled with each rap. I glanced back into the kitchen. The jester was gone. It had either fallen behind some of the bags or had moved away. Neither option made me feel too good. If this thing could skulk through the trash without making a sound, it could sneak right up behind us without us knowing. I didn't know if it was violent, and I had no intention of finding out, but the thought nested in my brain and set up shop. "Dee, the doll is gone." "Man, fuck this place," he said, nodding toward the door. "Let's get the hell out of here." "Best idea I've heard today." I said, heading toward the door. Dee got there first, and when he grabbed the handle, he let out a painful yelp. I didn't need to ask what happened because I had heard the sizzle. He pulled his hand back, and the mark had already reddened and started to swell. "What the hell?" he said, blowing on his hand as if his breath would cure it. The knocking in the closet started up again. It was loud from the jump, but the noise that bothered me was hearing the doorknob turn and the closet door squeak open. I ran out of the vestibule and back into the living room to discover the jester hanging from the handle. Its half face was turned up into a crooked smile. "Dee," I said, my voice trailing. He walked over to me, and when he saw Trashley hanging from the door, all the blood ran from his face. "Hey, hello?" I offered to the open door. Nothing but silence was coming from the closet. I was happy for the silence, loved every sweet second of it. Maybe it meant that all this hoodoo voodoo shit was over, and we could get back to normal. It wasn't over. The closet door flew open, sending the jester doll flying into the kitchen and out of sight. We heard something breathing inside the darkness of the closet. Across the living room, there was a movement in the trash piles. I looked over to see the mannequin hand flying through the air and back into the closet. "We gotta go," I said. Dee slapped at the front door handle again, which was still hot. He shook his head. "I can't go this way." We burst back into the living room and heard more rumbling from the closet. Keeping a wide berth, we stayed away from the closet and eyed the back door in the kitchen. Before we could step in that direction, there was another bone-shaking thunderclap. This time, though, all the piles of trash from the back bedrooms flooded into the living room and created a wall of garbage blocking access to the back of the house. There was a growl from the closet, and we both looked over and saw that mannequin's hand reach out and grip the door frame. Whatever was in there had attached the arm to its body and was pulling into the living room. That was our signal to get the hell out. We turned to run, and all of the kitchen trash rushed forward. Like the back room trash, the bags formed a wall trapping us inside the living room. There was another growl from the closet, and a second arm reached out and grabbed the door frame. This arm looked organic, but not well. The flesh was gray and ripped. You could see muscles and bones as the arm flexed on the door. "Fuck this," Dee said. He ran at the wall of trash blocking the kitchen and threw his whole massive frame into it. Like the Kool-Aid Man, he burst through and landed with a thud on the filthy floor. His plan worked, and even though he was covered in foul-smelling shit juice and in a living nightmare, he turned back to me with a smile so wide you would have thought he'd just won the Powerball. The smile quickly faded. From the top of the refrigerator, Trashley uncoiled like a spring and launched itself at Dee with an old, rusty knife in its tiny hands. It landed with a chaotic thud, but quickly scrambled to its feet and sunk the blade into Dee's calves. Dee screamed, but the doll just kept slashing at his legs. Blood was pouring out of a dozen wounds and mixing in with the rotten garbage on the floor. Dee tried grabbing the jester, but it quickly jabbed the knife forward and clean through Dee's hand. It tried pulling the blade out, but was stuck on the gristle and tendons. I leaped through the wall and landed on the slick floor like Bambi stepping on ice. Unlike the deer, though, I kept my balance. Dee screamed at me to help him. I took one good step and booted Trashley in the face, sending it violently flying across the room. It landed against the stove like the rag doll it was, and I heard its porcelain face crack even further. I reached down and pulled Dee up. He screamed in pain, and blood was gushing from his wounds, but he knew enough to get to stepping. There was a roar from the closet, and I peeked over my shoulder long enough to see a set of bull horns trying to wedge through the narrow closet door. "We gotta move," I said, shouldering Dee's weight under my own. He was struggling to walk, and the pain was exquisite, but to his credit, he was not letting the oozing wounds slow him down. I'm convinced he would have just ripped that leg off at the knee and hobbled out the door if he could have. We got to the back door, and I slapped at the handle. Like the front door, it was hot as well. I looked around for anything to cover my hand and spied an old rag in a nearby trash bag. With my free hand, I ripped it open and grabbed the rag. It was wet and smelled like death, but I didn't care. I touched the rag to the handle. It sizzled, and I could still feel the intense heat on my skin. But it worked well enough to try to open the door. The handle wouldn't budge. I dropped the rag and tried to boot the door open, but all that did was send pain up my leg and back. I swore, but it was drowned out by the crashing coming from the living room. I glanced back and saw the closet door frame being ripped from the walls. "Look out!" Dee yelled. I turned in time to see Trashley leaping through the air with a fork in their hands. It landed on my leg and sunk the fork's tines into the back of my knee. I screamed in pain and lost my footing, sending both Dee and I to the ground. I had collapsed onto the doll and could feel it jabbing my shoulders with the fork. I sat up, and the jester leapt for my face. Dee, without hesitation, plucked the doll out of the air like he was snagging a line drive. In one fluid motion, he turned and hurled it hard against the stove again. I scrambled to my feet, my knees burning, and tried to bash the door open. I hit it 3 times as hard as my body could handle, and all I did was damage my shoulder. I went to slam into it a 4th time when I felt Dee's hand grab the waist of my pants and yank me down. I landed hard on top of him, but he didn't mind. As I slammed into his chest, I turned to see Trashley grab the bottom of the stove with its stringy felt arms and easily lift it off the ground. With the ease of an ace pitcher hurling a fastball, the doll threw the stove in our direction. My old duck and cover drills came into practice, and I covered my neck and head as the stove flew over our bodies. The stove slammed into the back door, cracking it in half and knocking it off its hinges. Daylight streamed in, and our salvation was a mere few feet away. I could see our way out to freedom, but it was just an oasis. The stove bounced off the wall, nicked my back, and landed square on Dee's right arm. It shattered under the weight. He let out a scream like a wounded wild animal. The way we were tangled up sent his painful hollering directly into my ear. He thrashed under me, trying to get away from the weight of the stove, but was only making the break worse. I rolled off of him, grabbed the stove, and pushed it off his mangled arm. I reached down and helped Dee up, but he could barely move. I was afraid he was in shock, and if we lingered any longer, the thing pulling itself out of the closet would be out and after us. I didn't know what it had planned for us, but I didn't think it would invite us to a potluck or anything. I know it hurts, bro, but we have to. Then I smelled the gas. I looked over to where the stove had been and saw the telltale wavy vision of leaking gas. At that moment, like divine inspiration, a plan came to me. I reached into my pocket and found my lighter. "I can't move," Dee said. "Just leave me, man." "Told you I wasn't a bitch," I said. "Give me 20 feet of hustle, and I can get us out of this mess." I showed him the lighter, and he knew the plan. D nodded, gritted his teeth, and leaned his weight on me. He was in so much pain, but he bit his lip and moved. I spied an old paper towel roll and grabbed it in my free hand. I managed to help D get out of the house and walked him about 15 feet into the backyard. I placed him on the ground. He grabbed his arm and let out a whimper, but didn't want to slow me down. "Take cover," I said, and he scooted away. I headed back to the house, but he called my name. I turned and saw his painful, sweaty face. "Toast these motherfuckers," he spat out. I nodded and headed back toward the house. I held the paper towel roll firmly and pulled out my lighter. I didn't know how fast the gas would ignite, but I knew I wouldn't be able to dawdle. I also realized this might be the last thing I ever did, but I was okay with that decision. It was worth it if I could send these two things back to hell. When I got to the door, the smell of gas was strong. This entire house was an accelerant, and everything would light up like a city's 4th of July celebration. I stepped inside, and it was surprisingly quiet. I looked over at where the closet door had been, and only saw a massive hole. The thing had gotten out, but I didn't know where or how. It was hiding. When I turned my attention back to the gas, I saw the jester. It was standing on the counter. As soon as I turned, it leapt at me. It landed on my neck and coiled its limbs around it like an anaconda. I struggled to breathe and fought with everything I had left in the tank. The jester's hands, previously soft and cotton-filled, were now tipped with razor-sharp claws. It raked those Kruger-esque daggers across my face. Blood gushed from my wounds and dripped into my eyes, blurring my vision. I screamed and pulled as hard as I could, but this little monster was velcroed to my body. I had dropped the lighter and paper towel roll in the struggle, but that was a secondary concern. I needed to get free before attempting to light this place up. I felt the doll's legs growing as it tried to wrap up my arms. I was face to face with its blinking, drawn-on eye. It opened its half-mouth, and inside was row upon row of porcelain daggers. It lunged for my face to bite my cheek, but I held it off as best as I could. The arms around my neck started to tighten, and around the edges of my eyes, the world began to dim. I was afraid I was done for. I felt my knees buckle, and I fell onto my back. The black edges of the vision were starting to tunnel. I had seconds to do something, or I'd be toast myself. I moved my thumbs under the jester's tightening arms and pushed with all my might. At first, it didn't budge, but then I felt the pressure lessen and could breathe again. "Fuck you," I spat, and funneled all my stored-up anger and resentment and strength into pushing this little clingy bitch off me. It snapped at my hands and caught my knuckles, but I kept going until its spindly arms were off my throat. I ripped its legs off my body and threw the jester right towards the gas leak. It crashed against the wall, its half-face shattering on impact. I searched around for my lighter and found it. I flicked the spark wheel so hard, I feared it'd break. There were a few sparks, but nothing caught. I urged it on, taking a peek at where the monster was. As I looked up, I saw the jester's new face. The porcelain had broken away to reveal a red and black pulsating mass of muscle, blood, and gore that dripped from the wound. There was a bellow from the living room, and a massive creature that looked strikingly like a minotaur, albeit with one mannequin arm, came stomping into view. It must have sensed my presence, because it roared again and charged at the wall. The wall shuddered and cracked, but held for the time being. I knew it had come down easy the next time it ran at the wall. I was running out of time. I pressed my thumb down hard on the spark wheel and gave it a skin-ripping spin. It worked. There was finally a dancing orange flame at the edge of the bick. I held it against the paper towel roll and waited for it to catch. The wait felt painstakingly long. The Minotaur bellowed again and slammed into the wall. Its massive head came through. I looked at the jester, getting down in a crouch to leap at me again. "Light, goddammit, light!" I screamed. The temperature finally hit 451 degrees, and the flame transferred from the lighter to the towel roll. I threw the roll at the jester as it took to the air. The roll hit him, and the impact sent them both to the floor. They landed right near the gas line. I managed to get about 7 feet outside before the flame caught the gas and sent the entire house sky high. My body was thrown like a rag doll 20 feet into the neighbor's backyard. I landed on my shoulder with a sickening thud and blacked out. Hours later, I woke up in a hospital room. A dozen or so machines around me were beeping and keeping me going. Pain racked my entire body, and each breath was a world of discomfort I'd never been to before, but I was alive. Officially, the cause of the explosion was a gas leak. The fire department said it might have been leaking for years, but it was hard to determine because of all the stuff crammed into the home. Dee was in the hospital for about 2 weeks before being released. I was stuck for a few more weeks, as the explosion had rocked my brain and gave me post-concussion symptoms. We shared a smoke outside on Dee's last day in the hospital. We talked about what happened and thought it best not to be totally honest with everyone. This was mainly because we were sure everyone hadn't been honest with us, especially Pete. The stranger had name-dropped him specifically, and Pete acted very strangely in the explosion's aftermath. He was surprised we had survived and asked a lot of odd questions, some of which seemed to suggest he knew more than he was letting on. Dee has slyly started looking for a new job, and I'll follow him when I get out. I'm counting down the days, not only because I'm sick of hospital food, but also because I don't feel safe here. Pete keeps popping in, and I swear I saw the stranger hanging around the lobby. But what really concerns me, and makes me think I might not make it out of here, is what happened last night. At about 3 in the morning, when everyone on the floor was sleeping, I heard a bell jingling in the corridor outside my room. When I went out to look, I saw the shadow of a short, long-limbed person turn the corner and disappear.